The first time the HOA dumped their plowed snow onto my property, I thought it was a mistake. The second time I knew it wasn't. Truck after truck showed up after every storm, piling icy, dirty snow higher and higher on land I owned, paid for, and maintained. They never asked, never warned me. And when I complained, they told me I should be grateful they were keeping the street clear. I tried to stop it the right way. I documented everything. I contacted the HOA. I even warned them. They ignored me. So when winter hit its worst and their arrogance peaked, I made one decision that flipped the entire situation. And that's when the HOA panicked, because the snow they dumped on me became the thing that shut them down completely. Before the snow ever became a weapon, before trucks showed up unannounced, before the HOA decided my land was their dumping ground, winter was just winter. Cold, predictable, manageable. I lived on a property that sat just outside a large HOA-managed neighborhood. Not inside it, not governed by it, not subject to its rules. My land bordered one of their internal streets, separated by nothing more than a shallow drainage ditch and a wide, open strip of grass that had always been understood, by everyone, as private property. Mine. I had owned the land for years. Paid county taxes on it. Maintained it myself. Mowed it, cleared it, marked it. There was no dispute about ownership. No shared easement. No maintenance agreement. The boundary lines were clearly recorded, surveyed, and filed long before the HOA neighborhood was ever built. But as the neighborhood grew, something changed. The HOA became more aggressive, more involved, more confident in its own authority. They managed snow removal, trash collection, landscaping, and road maintenance for hundreds of homes. They had contracts, budgets, committees. And over time they began acting less like a neighborhood association and more like a small, private government. At first it didn't affect me. When winter came, their plow trucks cleared the streets efficiently. Snowbanks formed neatly along the curbs. Everything stayed on their side of the road. Life went on. Then came the first big storm of the season. Heavy snow. Wet snow. The kind that piles fast and freezes hard overnight. I woke up the next morning to the sound of diesel engines. Beeping. Metal scraping pavement. I looked out and saw multiple HOA contracted plow trucks clearing the street next to my property. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was where the snow went. Instead of piling it along the curb or pushing it into designated snow zones within the neighborhood, the plows angled their blades toward my land. Load after load of dirty, compacted snow was pushed straight across the ditch and dumped onto my property. Not a little. A lot. By noon, a long ridge of snow stretched across my frontage. Mixed with gravel, salt, ash chunks, frozen debris. It blocked access to part of my land and flattened the grass beneath it. I assumed it was a mistake. Plow drivers work fast. Visibility is bad. Boundaries blur during storms. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I didn't call anyone. I didn't complain. I waited. A week later, another storm hit. This time I watched. From my window, I saw the plow slow near my property line, angled deliberately, and dump the snow in the exact same place. The pile grew higher, wider, harder. That's when concern replaced assumption. Because now it wasn't accidental. It was consistent. I walked out and checked the damage. The snowbank had crushed part of my drainage line. Meltwater pooled where it shouldn't. Ice formed overnight and turned the area into a frozen hazard. If someone slipped and got hurt on my land, it would be my problem. If water backed up and damaged something, it would be my expense. I documented everything. Photos, videos, dates, storm totals. Then I contacted the HOA. The response was casual. They told me snow removal was a logistical necessity. They said my land was the most convenient area. They claimed they weren't causing damage, just temporary inconvenience. Temporary. That word would come up a lot. I reminded them the land was private. They said it wasn't permanent. That I asked them to stop. They said they'd look into it. They didn't. The third storm made their intentions unmistakable. More trucks, more snow, bigger piles. By then the snowbanks were taller than my waist. Frozen solid. Laced with road salt that killed the grass beneath it. Meltwater flooded into areas it never had before. I contacted the HOA again. This time the tone changed. They told me they had a responsibility to keep roads clear. They implied I was interfering with public safety. They suggested I was being unreasonable. Unreasonable, for not wanting their snow dumped on my land. They never denied what they were doing. They justified it. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about snow. It was about convenience and power. They had decided my property was easier to use than finding proper snow storage. They had decided I wouldn't fight back. They had decided that winter gave them cover to do whatever they wanted. And winter had only just begun. By the time the fourth storm rolled in, I already knew what was coming. The weather forecast barely mattered anymore. Snowfall totals didn't matter. Wind direction didn't matter. I could tell what kind of day it would be just by listening for engines. Early morning. Still dark. The low rumble of diesel. The scrape of steel against pavement. The steady beep of trucks reversing. They didn't even pretend anymore. The plows lined up along the street like clockwork. One after another, blade angled the same way, pushing every load of snow toward my land. The ditch disappeared under compacted ice. The grass vanished. The pile grew taller, denser, heavier. And this time, it didn't stop at the edge of the property. Snow spilled inward, spread outward, blocked access to part of my driveway. Froze into ridges that couldn't be moved by shovel or blower. I went outside and waved at one of the drivers. He didn't look at me. Another driver did and shrugged. That shrug said everything. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't oversight. It was instruction. Someone had told them exactly where to dump. I called the HOA again. This time I asked for the property manager. He sounded annoyed before I even finished explaining. He said snow removal was challenging. He said they were doing their best. He said my land was unimproved and therefore less sensitive. Less sensitive. As if ownership changed based on grass height. I reminded him, again, that it was private property, that the dumping was damaging my land, that the snowbanks were creating drainage problems and safety hazards. He paused. Then he said something that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. Well, it's winter. Snow has to go somewhere. Somewhere. Not their sidewalks. Not their green spaces. Not designated snow zones. Somewhere easier. I documented everything again. Video of the trucks. Close-ups of the piles. Measurements of the height. Photos of pooling water and ice. I emailed the HOA with evidence attached. They didn't respond. Instead, the next storm brought more trucks. More snow. And something new. They started pushing snow earlier in the storm, before plowing the rest of the street, so the piles would freeze faster and be harder to move later. That's when the damage crossed from annoying to serious. As temperatures dropped, meltwater from the piles refroze overnight. Thick ice spread across the lower part of my property. I slipped once and caught myself before hitting the ground. The fall could have been bad. If anyone else had been there, delivery driver, visitor, neighbor, it could have been worse. I sent another message to the HOA. This one was firmer. I warned them the dumping was unsafe. I warned them the damage was escalating. I warned them I would take action if it continued. They finally responded. Short, cold, defensive. They said they had authority to manage snow removal, as necessary. They said my concerns were noted. They said winter conditions were temporary. Temporary again. They leaned on that word like it absolved them of responsibility. Then came the fines. Not against me, but against residents who complained. I found out later that a few homeowners inside the HOA had asked why the snow was being dumped onto private land. The board didn't like that. Those homeowners were cited for unrelated violations. Landscaping issues. Trash bin placement. Minor infractions suddenly enforced with enthusiasm. That sent a message. Don't question us. The snow dumping continued. Every storm added another layer. The piles turned gray and black from road grime. The salt burned the ground beneath. The weight compressed the soil until it felt like concrete underfoot. I contacted the county. They told me snow dumping on private land without consent could be a violation. They suggested I try resolving it directly first. I told them I had. They suggested I document more. I already had. Winter dragged on. Storm after storm. And with each one the HOA grew bolder. They stopped responding entirely. No emails. No calls returned. No acknowledgement. They had decided my silence or exhaustion was inevitable. That's when I realized something else. They weren't just dumping snow. They were testing boundaries. Seeing how much I would tolerate. How long I would wait. How far they could go before I snapped or gave up. They expected anger. They expected shouting. They expected a confrontation they could frame as me being unreasonable. What they didn't expect was patience. Because while they kept dumping snow, I was learning something important about winter, municipal rules, and the physical properties of compacted ice. And once I understood how their system worked, I began planning how to use it against them. By midwinter, the snowbanks on my land had stopped looking like piles and started looking like structures. They were taller than my truck in some places. Hard-packed, layered. Each storm adding another frozen slab on top of the last. The surface turned gray from salt and oil. The inside became solid ice, compressed by the weight of repeated dumping. And the HOA kept coming. They dumped during daylight. They dumped at night. They dumped during active snowfall and after storms ended. No notice. No apology. No permission. I stopped calling them. Not because I gave up, but because I understood something important. Every call gave them warning. Every complaint gave them time to adjust. So I went quiet. I documented instead. I logged storm dates, truck arrival times, plow patterns, snow volumes. I measured how far the piles encroached inward. I tracked where meltwater flowed. I noted where ice formed first, where it lingered longest. Because winter doesn't just create problems. It creates evidence. Then the real damage started. As temperatures fluctuated, meltwater from the snowbanks began flooding back toward the HOA street. At night it refroze. Thick sheets of ice formed along the roadway edge, right where residents walked, where kids crossed to get to the bus stop, where cars slowed to turn. I saw the first near accident one morning. A car slid sideways at low speed, tires spinning uselessly before regaining traction. No crash. No injury. But it was close. And it wasn't isolated. Residents started complaining. Not about me. About the ice. They didn't know where it came from. They didn't know why it kept forming in the same spot after every storm. The HOA responded by sending salt trucks. More salt meant more melt. More melt meant more refreeze. The cycle fed itself. And every time they tried to fix it, they made it worse. That's when the HOA began pushing back in a different way. I received a letter. Not about snow. About my fence. They claimed part of it was too close to the street. They demanded I move it back. They cited HOA guidelines. Guidelines that didn't apply to me. I ignored it. Then came another letter. This one about unauthorized drainage interference. They accused me of altering water flow. I hadn't touched anything. They were laying groundwork. Creating a narrative. If something went wrong, they wanted a scapegoat ready. I contacted an attorney. Not to sue. To understand. We reviewed property boundaries, easements, and municipal snow disposal rules. We reviewed liability related to snow dumping and secondary hazards. And that's when something clicked. The HOA wasn't just dumping snow illegally. They were transferring liability. By pushing snow onto my land, they were moving responsibility for meltwater, ice formation, and downstream hazards onto me. If someone slipped, if a car crashed, if damage occurred, they could point at my property. That realization changed everything. Because now this wasn't just disrespect. It was risk. And risk has rules. I sent one final notice. Not emotional. Not angry. Formal. I stated clearly that the dumping must stop. That continued dumping would be documented as trespass and unauthorized material disposal. That I would take steps to protect my property and limit liability. I gave them a deadline. They ignored it. The next storm was the biggest of the season. Heavy snowfall over 12 hours. Plows ran non-stop. Trucks lined the street like an assembly line. They dumped more snow on my land than ever before. And this time they didn't even pretend it was incidental. They cleared the street clean and pushed everything onto me. That night, temperatures dropped sharply. Single digits. The piles froze solid. And the meltwater flowed exactly where physics said it would. Across their street. By morning, the HOA road was a sheet of ice. Cars slid. Residents complained. Emails flew. The HOA scrambled. They brought out salt, then sand, then more plows. Nothing worked. Because the source of the ice wasn't on the road, it was on my land. And that's when I realized the truth. I didn't need to fight them. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to sue. All I had to do was stop absorbing their problem and let winter do the rest. I didn't change anything right away. That part mattered. After the biggest storm of the season, when the street iced over and residents started complaining, the HOA assumed the problem would pass like everything else. Another storm. Another plow run. Another temporary fix. They were wrong. Because for the first time all winter I stopped helping. Before that storm I had quietly done things to protect myself. I redirected minor runoff where I could. I chipped away ice near my fence line. I cleared narrow paths to prevent pooling. Not because I owed the HOA anything, but because I didn't want my land becoming a hazard. After that storm I did nothing. I let the snow sit. I let the piles harden. I let meltwater follow gravity, not courtesy. The result was immediate. By mid-morning the HOA's internal street was barely passable. Cars crawled. Tires spun. Residents parked farther away and walked. Delivery drivers refused to enter. Parents complained that buses were skipping stops. The HOA sent crews again. Salt trucks dumped loads. Sand was spread. Plows scraped ice only to have it reform hours later. Because the source of the problem wasn't on the street. It was uphill. On my property. That's when the HOA president contacted me directly for the first time all winter. Her message wasn't apologetic. It wasn't conciliatory. It was panicked. She said the ice issue was unacceptable. She accused me of allowing hazardous conditions to develop. She implied I was responsible for the safety of their residents. I replied once. Brief. Documented. Come. I reminded her that the snow had been dumped on my land without permission. That repeated notices had been ignored. That the ice was a direct consequence of their actions. And then I said something that shifted the tone completely. I said I would no longer interfere with natural conditions created by materials placed illegally on my property. No threats. No ultimatums. Just a statement of fact. Within hours, HOA trucks showed up again. Not to plow. To inspect. They stood near the boundary line, gesturing, pointing, talking urgently into phones. One of them stepped onto my land to examine the snowbanks. I documented that too. Trespass. Then came the emails. Residents demanded answers. Parents demanded safer streets. Contractors demanded access. The HOA responded with vague reassurances. We're addressing it. Crews are working. Conditions will improve. They didn't. Another cold night locked everything in place. And now the HOA faced a problem they couldn't fix without admitting the truth. To stop the ice, they would have to remove the snow from my land. To remove the snow, they would have to acknowledge it shouldn't have been there. And to acknowledge that, they would have to admit fault. They chose denial instead. They accused me publicly of weaponizing weather. They claimed I was acting maliciously. They threatened legal action, citing nuisance laws and public safety concerns. But the law wasn't on their side. Snow dumped illegally doesn't become someone else's responsibility just because it melts. The county confirmed that quietly. The HOA president didn't like that answer. She demanded I allow their crews onto my land to correct the issue. I refused. Not angrily. Legally. I told her any entry without permission would be trespass. Any removal of material would require written acknowledgement that the snow was dumped improperly. She stopped responding. That silence lasted 2 days. Then came the storm that changed everything. Not heavy snowfall, freezing rain. It coated everything. The snowbanks became solid ice. Meltwater froze mid-flow. The street turned into a skating rink. Emergency vehicles struggled. A delivery truck slid into a curb. No injuries, but close enough to trigger serious concern. That was the moment the HOA lost control of the narrative. County officials were contacted. Public Works asked questions. Photos circulated. Residents started connecting dots. They saw where the snow was. They saw where the ice came from. They saw who caused it. The HOA president tried one last move. She sent a cease and desist letter accusing me of intentionally creating hazardous conditions. I forwarded it to my attorney. He replied with a single sentence. Your client created this condition and is attempting to shift responsibility. And just like that, the balance tipped. The HOA wasn't fighting me anymore. They were fighting gravity, physics, documentation, and time. And winter wasn't done yet. The day everything finally broke didn't begin with chaos. It began with quiet. No plow engines. No scraping steel. No flashing amber lights. Just a heavy, unmoving stillness outside my window. The kind of silence that feels unnatural after months of constant activity. The kind that tells you something is about to change. Then my phone started buzzing. At first it was just one message. A neighbor from inside the HOA, someone I barely knew, sent a photo. The entire street was encased in ice. Not patches. Not slick spots. A solid, uninterrupted sheet stretching curb to curb. Another message came in seconds later. Then another. Parents were saying buses couldn't safely stop. Delivery drivers were refusing to enter the street. Cars were sliding at walking speed. People were abandoning vehicles and walking the rest of the way. And then came the message that shifted everything. An ambulance had been delayed. Not blocked completely. Not turned away. Delayed just long enough to terrify people. That was the moment fear replaced inconvenience. By mid-morning, the HOA's usual contractors were nowhere to be seen. They had tried everything they could do without admitting fault. More salt. More sand. More scraping. Nothing worked. Because the problem wasn't on the road. It was uphill. On my land. County vehicles arrived before the HOA could spin the story. Public works trucks. Inspectors. Officials who didn't answer to boards, committees, or angry emails. They walked slowly. Deliberately. Taking photos. Measuring ice thickness. Watching meltwater refreeze in real time. They followed the flow. Straight up the grade. Straight to the snowbanks. Straight to my property line. That's when the HOA president arrived. She came fast. Rushed. Flustered. Still trying to command authority that was already slipping away. She spoke loudly. Pointed. Explained. Deflected. She blamed weather. She blamed runoff. She blamed unusual winter conditions. The inspector let her finish. Then asked a single question. Who placed this snow here? No one answered. Not immediately. Because the answer was obvious. He turned to me and asked if I had given permission for snow dumping on my property. I said no. He asked if there was any easement allowing it. There wasn't. He asked if I had previously complained or warned the HOA. I handed him the documentation. Photos. Emails. Dates. Logs. Written notices. He read quietly. The HOA president tried to interrupt. He stopped her with a raised hand. Then he issued the order. The HOA was responsible for removing every ounce of snow dumped on my land. At their expense. Immediately. No delays. No negotiation. And until that happened, the street would be partially restricted for safety. The HOA president protested. Loudly. She said it was impossible. Said the snow was frozen solid. Said removal would take days. The inspector didn't hesitate. Then you should not have put it there. That sentence landed harder than any fine. Because it was undeniable. Crews were dispatched within the hour. Not the HOA's usual plow trucks. Heavy equipment. Loaders. Dump trucks. Ice breakers. Machines used for municipal emergencies and structural removal. They tore into the piles like concrete. Huge slabs cracked loose with sharp echoing sounds. Frozen layers that had been compacted over weeks were peeled away piece by piece. Residents gathered along the street. Phones came out. People filmed. People whispered. Conversations spread. For the first time all winter, everyone could see exactly where the ice had been coming from. And they could see who put it there. The HOA president stood off to the side, arms crossed, face tight with rage and disbelief. She no longer gave orders. No one was listening. Then the inspector returned. He issued a citation. Unauthorized dumping. Improper snow disposal. Creation of hazardous conditions. A fine. A written warning. A permanent record. The HOA tried to argue. The inspector shut it down. This wasn't accidental, he said. This was a choice. By late afternoon, the street was finally passable. Not perfect, but safe. But the damage had already spread far beyond ice. Residents demanded answers. Emergency HOA meetings were called. Board members argued openly for the first time. Emails flooded inboxes. Accusations flew. The narrative collapsed. They couldn't blame weather anymore. They couldn't blame me. They couldn't hide behind process. Everyone had seen the snow being removed from land it never should have been on. The HOA president didn't survive that day politically. By the end of the week, she resigned. Quietly. Without explanation. Without apology. Other board members followed. Some claimed ignorance. Others admitted they had gone along with decisions they knew were wrong because it was easier than pushing back. The illusion of authority shattered. And winter kept going. But this time, every storm was handled differently. Snow stayed where it belonged. Because now, everyone knew what happened when power crossed a line. What surprised me most wasn't how fast the HOA collapsed once everything became public. It was how quiet the collapse was. There was no dramatic announcement. No final email admitting fault. No apology letter explaining what went wrong. The HOA didn't face its reckoning with noise, it faced it with absence. Meetings quietly disappeared from the calendar. Email responses slowed to a crawl. The website stopped updating. Residents noticed. People who had lived under constant reminders, warnings, and enforcement suddenly found themselves in an unfamiliar position. No instructions, no threats, no notices taped to doors. At first, that silence made people uneasy. Then it made them angry. Because once the HOA lost the ability to intimidate, it also lost the ability to explain itself. Residents began demanding records. Budgets. Decision logs. Contractor agreements. They wanted to know how snow dumping decisions were made. Who approved them. Whether the board ever considered private property rights before choosing convenience. Those records didn't paint the HOA in a good light. What emerged was a pattern of shortcuts. Of decisions made quickly, justified later. Of problems temporarily solved without considering long-term consequences. Snow dumping was just the most visible example. Once people saw that, they started asking different questions. Why were fines issued so inconsistently? Why were some violations ignored while others were enforced aggressively? Why did some residents seem untouchable while others were constantly targeted? The answers were uncomfortable. Favoritism. Complacency. A board that had gone unchallenged for too long. The county didn't stop at snow. Once inspectors had a reason to review HOA operations, they expanded their scope. Drainage systems. Retention ponds. Sidewalk maintenance. Stormwater compliance. Each review uncovered small issues, nothing catastrophic but enough to confirm a broader truth. Oversight had been missing. And oversight, once restored, changes behavior quickly. By late winter, the HOA was operating under conditions it hadn't experienced in years. Decisions had to be documented. Contractors had to follow clear guidelines. Deviations required explanation. It slowed everything down. That slowdown frustrated some people, but it protected everyone. On my end, the consequences unfolded more gradually. The land didn't bounce back overnight. Soil compacted by months of frozen weight doesn't simply relax when snow melts. I spent weeks repairing drainage, reseeding grass, restoring contours that had been flattened by tons of ice. It was work I never should have had to do. But it was also grounding. Every shovel of soil reminded me why I fought in the first place. Not out of anger, but out of responsibility. This was my land, my liability, my future. And defending it wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Spring brought clarity. As the snow disappeared, so did excuses. What remained was evidence, etched into the land, recorded in county files, discussed openly in meetings that no longer felt hostile. People stopped avoiding eye contact. Neighbors waved again. Some even admitted they had been afraid to speak up before. Afraid of fines. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid of becoming the next problem. What happened with the snow showed them something important. The HOA's power wasn't absolute. It was conditional. Conditional on silence. Conditional on compliance. Conditional on people not pushing back. Once that illusion broke, it didn't come back. The next winter was different. Snow fell. Plows ran. Streets were cleared. But this time snow stayed where it belonged. Boundaries were respected, not because people suddenly became kinder but because accountability had teeth now. Every storm served as a reminder. Every plow pass reinforced a lesson. And every resident knew what had happened when those lessons were ignored. Looking back, the story isn't really about snow. Snow just revealed what was already there. A system that prioritized convenience over consent. Authority over fairness. Control over responsibility. The moment someone refused to absorb the consequences quietly, the system unraveled. Not violently. Not dramatically. But completely. And that's the part most people don't expect. Power doesn't usually collapse in explosions. It collapses in exposure. So if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. You don't have to fight authority head-on to stop it from overreaching. Sometimes all you have to do is step aside and let the weight of its own decisions fall where they belong. Because eventually, everything does.